The sun dipped low over Willow Lake, painting the water with strokes of gold and rose. The wind moved softly through the willow trees, carrying with it the faint scent of wet earth and pine. And there, on the same wooden bench near the shore, sat Edward, a man whose days had grown quieter with the passing years. Every evening, for nearly 3 years, he came to that bench. He'd sit with his cane resting beside him, his hat tilted low, and his eyes lost somewhere in the reflection of the fading light. Sometimes he read an old newspaper. Sometimes he just listened to the birds, to the wind, or to the stillness that had become his closest companion. But he wasn't entirely alone. On the far side of the bench sat Martha, an elderly woman wrapped in a knitted shawl of pale blue, her silver hair tied neatly in a bun. She arrived almost at the same time every day, a few minutes after Edward, and always took the same spot. They never spoke, not once in 3 years. Yet, somehow, they understood each other perfectly. It had started one autumn evening when Edward first noticed her sitting there, quietly gazing at the lake. He thought she might be waiting for someone, perhaps a friend, or a son, or a husband. But no one ever came. She just sat as he did, letting the silence fill the empty corners of her heart. Over time, their unspoken company became a routine neither could let go of. They never exchanged a word, but their presence became the kind of comfort that words couldn't give. A soft understanding that you are not alone, even in silence. One breezy evening in late spring, Edward brought 2 apples with him. He wasn't sure why, maybe just a quiet thought that she might like one. He placed the extra apple beside him, pretending to be casual about it. Martha glanced at it, smiled faintly, and nodded. She didn't take it, but her eyes softened in a way that made Edward's heart feel lighter than it had in years. It became a habit after that. Sometimes he'd bring 2 biscuits. Sometimes she'd bring a thermos and pour tea into 2 cups, placing one beside him without a word. They'd sit like that, sharing small things, saying nothing, yet speaking volumes. The lake mirrored them like 2 old trees, separate roots, but branches that leaned toward each other. Edward often wondered about her story. Who was she? Did she have children? Was she a widow, like him? He thought of asking many times, but the silence between them felt sacred, like breaking it might undo everything. And so, he kept his questions buried, along with the words he didn't know how to say. Still, sometimes, when she wasn't looking, he studied her face, the faint tremble in her fingers, the way she'd smile at the ripples on the water, the soft hum she sometimes made under her breath, a tune he almost recognized but could never quite place. There was something deeply peaceful about Martha. She seemed to carry her sadness gently, like a folded letter she chose not to open. One evening, as the sky turned lavender, Edward found the courage to whisper, "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" Martha turned to him, surprised, then smiled, warm and kind. "It always is," she replied softly. Her voice was gentle, like the rustle of leaves. That was all, just 6 words. But to Edward, it felt like a beginning. From that day onward, their silence changed. Now and then, they spoke, a sentence here, a memory there. Little fragments of lives, once full, now quieter, but not forgotten. She told him she used to teach music. She played the piano for her church choir, that her husband, Thomas, had passed away almost 15 years ago. And since then, she'd come to the lake every evening, because it was where they'd first met, many decades earlier. Edward listened quietly. "He must have been a lucky man," he said softly. She smiled. "I think I was the lucky one." When she asked about his life, Edward told her about his late wife, Clara, how she loved tending roses, how she made their small house smell like fresh bread and laughter, how he still spoke to her sometimes, before going to bed. "She was my anchor," he said. "And when she left, it felt like the sea just kept pulling me away." Martha reached out her hand and placed it lightly over his. "Then you found your way back," she whispered, "because here you are." Their friendship deepened after that, still quiet, still tender, but now with tiny ripples of conversation. They began to share old photos. Martha showed him one of her and Thomas standing beside a vintage car, smiling as though time had no claim on them. Edward showed her a faded photograph of his wife, holding a basket of roses, sunlight spilling across her face. "You know," Martha said one evening, "I think this bench has a kind heart. It listens to us, you and me." Edward chuckled softly. "Then, I suppose we should thank it for keeping our secrets." Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The seasons changed, but they stayed, two old souls, keeping each other company as the world rushed past them. Sometimes, Edward would imagine what people thought when they saw them there. Perhaps they assumed they were old lovers or lifelong friends, but to him, it didn't matter what they thought. What mattered was the peace he felt, something he hadn't known in years. Then, one day, Martha didn't come. Edward waited and waited. The sun sank low, the air grew cold, and still her spot remained empty. He told himself maybe she was unwell, or that she'd come tomorrow, but she didn't. The following evening, he came again. Her side of the bench was still empty. The air felt heavier somehow, and the lake seemed to still. By the third evening, Edward's hands shook slightly as he set down 2 cups of tea, one untouched, growing cold beside him. It was the first time he realized just how much she meant to him. And my dear listener, if this story has touched a small corner of your heart so far, if you've ever had someone whose presence made silence feel full, I ask you, with the gentlest voice, to help us keep telling stories like this. Even a small donation through PayPal, the link is in the description, helps me keep this channel alive for you, for the quiet evenings, for the warmth we share through words. Now, let's return to Edward's story. The next morning, he went to the park office, asking if anyone knew about her. "Do you know the lady who sits by the lake every evening, silver hair, blue shawl?" he asked the young park attendant. The boy thought for a moment. "You mean Mrs. Martha?" "Yes, that's her. She used to come here every day," the boy said quietly, "but she hasn't been well lately. She's in St. Mary's care home. It's not far from here." Edward nodded, feeling a mix of relief and worry. He'd half feared the worst. The following morning, he dressed neatly, his best coat, freshly pressed shirt, and took the bus to St. Mary's. He carried with him a small bouquet of white daisies. When he entered, a nurse guided him to a quiet room where Martha sat by the window, a blanket over her knees, staring out at the sky. When she turned and saw him, her face lit up. "Edward," she whispered, "you found me." "I was starting to think I'd lost you," he said softly, smiling as he set the flowers on the table beside her. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, about the lake, the ducks that had started nesting again, about how the bench felt emptier without her there. "I miss it," she said quietly, "but I'm too weak to walk that far now." Edward squeezed her hand. "Then I'll bring the lake to you." And he did. Every few days, he'd come with a fresh story from the park, describing the sky, the water, the children playing, the breeze, even the way the leaves moved. He painted pictures with words, and Martha would close her eyes and smile, as if she could see it all again. Sometimes, he'd hum an old tune, and she'd join softly, the same melody she used to hum on the bench. That was when he realized that tune was her way of remembering peace. As weeks passed, Martha's health began to fade. She spoke less, slept more, but always smiled when she saw him. One afternoon, as he was leaving, she said something that stayed with him forever. "Edward, when I go, don't stop coming to the bench. Some people leave, but the connection doesn't. The lake will still be there, and I'll be somewhere in the silence between the waves." Edward nodded, though his throat felt tight. He couldn't bear to imagine that bench without her. That evening, he sat there alone, the reflection of the moon trembling on the water, and for the first time, he felt afraid of the silence he once cherished. But he stayed, because that's what Martha would have done. The days grew shorter, the air turned cool, brushing against Edward's cheeks as he sat alone by the lake. The bench, once a space shared between 2 quiet hearts, now felt too large, too hollow. He still came every evening. Old habits have their roots deep, and he had grown around that very spot, under that old willow tree. Sometimes he'd close his eyes and imagine Martha sitting beside him again, humming softly. The faint scent of her lavender perfume lingered in his memory, so vivid that he almost believed it was carried by the wind itself. But when he opened his eyes, there was only the lake and the whisper of water brushing the shore. He'd brought 2 cups of tea, as always, one for himself, one for her. The second cup remained untouched, the steam curling into the fading dusk like a spirit returning home. Winter approached. Snow began to dust the park paths, and yet Edward came every single day. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was loyalty, or love, or simply a need to hold on to something that made sense in a world that often didn't. One afternoon, as he sat watching a few ducks glide across the half-frozen lake, he noticed something unusual. Beneath the bench, tucked into the small crack between 2 wooden planks, was a folded piece of paper. It was yellowed by the cold, damp air, its edges curled. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for it. He unfolded it carefully, the way you might open something sacred. The handwriting was shaky, but unmistakably familiar. It was Martha's. Dear Edward, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't make it back to our bench. Please don't be sad. The world gave me a beautiful gift before I left your friendship. You reminded me that love doesn't always need to be spoken. Sometimes it's enough to sit beside someone who understands your silence. Thank you for giving me my evenings back. Thank you for letting me feel seen again. I've left something for you under the stone by the right leg of the bench. It's small, but I hope it brings you warmth on cold nights. With love, Martha. Edward froze for a long time. His heart felt both heavy and light at once, as though sorrow and peace had somehow decided to share the same space inside him. He reached under the bench, lifting the small stone Martha had mentioned. Beneath it was a tiny box wrapped in an old handkerchief. Inside, there was a silver locket, engraved with a simple line, for the moments words couldn't say. He opened it slowly. Inside was a faded picture, not of Thomas, her late husband, but of him and her, sitting together on the bench, smiling faintly. Someone must have taken it from afar. Edward's eyes blurred with tears. He couldn't remember ever smiling that openly since Clara had passed away. But there it was, proof that somehow he had healed without even realizing it. That night, he sat longer than usual, staring at the stars. The lake mirrored them perfectly, and for the first time, he didn't feel alone. Martha had left, but the connection hadn't. She had become part of the lake, the air, the silence they once shared. He spoke softly, his voice carried away by the wind. Thank you, Martha, for reminding me how to live again. Weeks turned into months. Winter gave way to spring. The trees sprouted new leaves, the air warmed, and the world seemed to breathe again. One Sunday morning, Edward arrived early, carrying a small notebook. On its first page, he wrote, "The bench by the lake, stories of 2 old souls." He began writing down every memory they'd shared, the tea, the apples, the quiet laughter, the words they never said but always felt. Every page became a tribute to the simple, gentle bond that had changed his twilight years. Children often passed by, curious about the old man scribbling by the lake. Sometimes he'd smile and say, "This bench listens better than most people, you know." And they'd giggle, not quite understanding. But that was all right. Someday they would. One morning, a young couple approached him. They'd seen him there often and were curious. "Sir," the woman said gently, "we see you here every evening. Did you know the lady who used to sit beside you?" Edward smiled, eyes glistening. "Yes," he said softly. "She was my quiet companion, my friend." The man nodded. "You too inspired us. We used to watch from the trail sometimes. It reminded us what real connection looks like." Edward chuckled. "It wasn't grand. We just sat together." The woman smiled. "Sometimes that's the grandest thing." As the couple walked away, Edward leaned back and sighed. He could almost hear Martha laughing at the thought that their quiet, ordinary friendship had touched strangers. He reached for his notebook again and wrote, "Some people enter our lives with fireworks. Others, like Martha, arrive like a slow sunrise, gentle, unnoticed, yet impossible to forget. That summer, the town held a small community event near Willow Lake, a gathering for local seniors. They invited Edward to speak. At first, he hesitated. Public speaking wasn't his thing. But then he remembered Martha's words. Some people leave, but the connection doesn't. So, he stood before the crowd, the lake glimmering behind him, and told their story. Not of romance, not of tragedy, but of quiet companionship and the courage to connect again after loss. When he finished, there was a long, tender silence. Then gentle applause, not loud, but full of heart. A few older couples held hands, a few wiped tears. And in that moment, Edward realized Martha was right. She hadn't really gone anywhere. She was right there, between every word he spoke. That night, when he returned to the bench, he found something unexpected. A small wooden plaque had been fixed to the backrest. It read, "The bench by the lake, for Martha and Edward, who taught us that silence can be full of love." He traced the letters with his fingertips, his chest tight with emotion. Then he sat down, whispering with a shaky laugh, "Well, Martha, looks like we've become a story." And in the stillness that followed, he could almost hear her reply, not in words, but in the way the breeze rustled through the trees, soft and familiar. As the sun began to set, Edward looked out at the shimmering water, feeling a strange sense of completeness. He finally understood what Martha had meant. Some people leave, but the connection doesn't. It wasn't about loss anymore. It was about gratitude. Gratitude for having met someone who made silence feel sacred. He took a deep breath, the air cool and fragrant, and smiled to himself. Then, softly, almost as if speaking to the lake itself, he whispered, "Thank you for finding me, my friend, my dear listener. If this story found a place in your heart, if you've ever known the quiet comfort of being understood without words, I want to thank you for spending these minutes with me tonight. If you'd like to help me keep telling stories like Edward and Martha's, you can support me through PayPal. The link is in the description. Your small kindness helps me bring warmth and companionship to countless others who listen before they sleep. And remember, just like the bench by the lake, sometimes being present is the greatest gift you can give. Good night, my friend, and may you never feel alone, even in silence."